As I've already made clear in quite a few videos on this channel, I do believe that the Disney Star Wars sequel trilogy, both as a trilogy and as individual movies, weren't all that good. Now I know that's far from a controversial opinion to have, as most can agree that, especially as a trilogy, the movies just don't work all that well. But the thing is, as a man who's written books, I was honestly left at something of a loss for some of the decisions that were made regarding those movies, because quite a bit of the stuff they did breaks some of the simplest core principles of writing. Now, I don't pretend to be a writing expert or anything like that, but let me just say, some of the mistakes and decisions here are classic examples of things I did when I was learning how to write. So the fact that these scripts were given the go-ahead by a company as huge as Disney regarding a franchise as popular and beloved as Star Wars simply baffles me. Because I'm just going to say it again. Some of the writing here seems to be on par with that of a 12-year-old, and the results honestly speak for themselves. Now, please do note that I'm not trying to attack, insult, or promote any hatred for anybody with this video. I'm just trying to point out how many frankly amateur mistakes were made in the writing of those movies. And today, I would like to draw on my own personal experiences as a writer to demonstrate a few specific examples of how poorly the sequel trilogy was actually written. And there obviously will be spoilers for all three movies ahead, as well as maybe another Star Wars movie or two. So in case there's something you don't want ruined, I would highly recommend not proceeding with this video. Okay, so to get right into it, the first point I would like to demonstrate here doesn't exactly come from my personal experiences as a writer, but more from an observation I've made regarding sequels in general, which is that if a sequel is claiming to be a direct continuation of something, but seems a lot more interested in new characters, it's introducing, or better yet, majorly rewrites old ones without acknowledging how they previously were, that is often a telltale sign that it isn't going to be great. Because that's usually a clear indicator that the writers are more interested in telling their own story rather than it being a genuine continuation of what had been set up before. And all three movies are guilty of this. In The Force Awakens, the spotlight is placed firmly on the new characters, and even the one older character that is given focus has had his character completely reverted with only a clumsy explanation as to why that is. Then in The Last Jedi, even more emphasis is placed on the new characters, as Rian Johnson makes it very clear that they are the only ones he's interested in telling a story with. And Luke Skywalker's character is completely different for no reason. Seriously, you can argue the point all you want, but the fact still remains that there was no reason, especially in story, for Luke to behave the way he does, other than because Rian Johnson wanted him to. He spends the whole movie placing his story over the bigger picture, and the results feel extremely odd and disjointed. And finally, The Rise of Skywalker is actually the least guilty of this, as it at least tries to place more emphasis on the older characters and make them feel like themselves, but at that point, the whole story has already fallen apart. And not to mention, it still manages to place its own story over the bigger picture by bringing the Emperor back without any explanation and playing fast and loose with the lore, which, if you know anything about writing world building, are two extremely big no-nos. Any old writing expert, which once again I will freely admit I'm not, and in no way claim to be, can tell you that. And speaking of that, What I'd now like to spend the rest of the video going over is signaling out a single aspect of each movie from the sequel trilogy and use my personal experience in writing to show just how amateurish it all really is. Now in The Force Awakens, what I want to point out mainly comes down to a single scene, which is when they go over the plans to Starkiller Base, and somebody notes that it's, quote, another Death Star. And their response is to compare the size of Starkiller Base to the Death Star, showing just how huge the planet killer really is. And this is only compounded by them using the base to destroy a whole star system rather than just a single planet. Now, what's my point with all of this? That those are extremely poor ways to try and up the ante. Because I remember back when I was younger and would write just for fun, this is exactly what I would do. Because not only would I borrow from my inspiration, similar to how The Force Awakens borrows its inspiration from A New Hope, but I would also up the stakes in a similar fashion. In my story, they were after 1,000 pieces of coin, then I would make it 10,000 pieces of gold. In the story, they were trying to enslave the world. In my story, they would try to enslave the universe. But please also note, I was writing this stuff when I was 10 or 12 years old. I didn't know anything about how to actually write a story yet. Because that's not how you raise the stakes. If you just keep doing the same things, only bigger each time, it's going to lose its impact. And not to mention, it's also not believable for the story either. Things don't just happen over and over again, only bigger. Basically, it's a very cheap way to make it feel as though the stakes are higher, and one that any professional writer should know to go out of their way to avoid. Because the best sequels are the ones that present completely different, but no less believable, stakes for the characters, as George Lucas did in the prequels. Again, what they did in The Force Awakens is just a very cheap way to make the threat feel bigger, but it falls completely flat, especially because they managed to blow it up within the same movie in more or less the same fashion as the original. If that scene set it up as a threat for the whole trilogy, that would be one thing. But considering it's taken out almost immediately... Now, some might counter this by arguing that George Lucas also brought back the Death Star for Return of the Jedi, and very few complained about it. But the thing is, that worked better because of the way it was written. Because first off, it makes sense that the Empire might try to build another one, considering the first one did work, and it was arguably the incompetence of the people involved that got it destroyed. So it is believable that the Emperor would want to give it another try. And the second reason is, it's not the main focus of the climax this time around. Instead, trying to destroy it is only the backdrop to the real conflict taking place, which is the final confrontation in the throne room. So the stakes are still different, even if the objective mission is the same. And even then, the actual mission is a rather different one. And finally, there's the fact that the Death Star is allowed to be a threat on its own merits. George Lucas doesn't have them compare it to the first to try and show why it's a much bigger threat. No. Instead, he relies on the fact that the audience already knows why the Death Star is so dangerous and must be taken out, which is only reinforced by the fact that it's revealed to be operational. But because The Force Awakens is copying from A New Hope without an in-story reason to, that's what they resort to make it feel like they aren't just repeating the same thing all over again. And I'm just going to say it again, as a man who's written books, that is a very amateur move. And the same goes for the Death Star destroyers in The Rise of Skywalker. Seriously, the lengths that movie goes to try and raise the stakes through making things bigger is ridiculous. But moving on to The Last Jedi, it's not a specific scene I want to point out this time, but something that's presented throughout the entire movie, which is that it passes off the ideas of other Star Wars movies as its own. Such lessons as, you don't need to come from something to be something, or failure is the greatest teacher. It's all stuff that's already been done in Star Wars. And yet, the movie tries to pass them off as if they're completely novel ideas in the Star Wars universe. And that's only just two examples of that. I can name plenty of other instances from The Last Jedi, and even the other two movies, of passing off ideas previously used in Star Wars as new and original to them. And once again, I would do the exact same thing when I would write just for fun. Now, obviously, I knew what plagiarism was and everything, but considering I was only doing this stuff for some family or friends to hear, I didn't worry about things like that. And there would be times I would copy directly from things I liked and try to present it as my own to get a reaction, even if in the back of my head I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. But that's what makes them doing it in Star Wars even worse. They really do think they're fooling people by doing this. And once again, it doesn't work nearly as well in the bigger picture as they'd like to believe it does. It almost reminds me of the quote, standing on the shoulders of giants and trying to claim you're tall. That's exactly what the sequel trilogy is guilty of with trying to pass off other people's ideas as their own. Because, like I said, at least when I did it, it was just for fun and nothing else. When I got serious about writing, I didn't do that anymore. And finally, there's The Rise of Skywalker. Now, let me just save time by saying, this movie makes so many amateur and writing 101 mistakes that I could honestly make a whole separate video on it, which I pretty much did, and you can find a link in the description too. But there's one particular aspect I want to point out in regards to my personal writing experience, which is all the bait and switch deaths. Now, as I even noted in that aforementioned video, after what the previous two movies had put them through regarding character deaths, audiences might have actually welcomed it, but it's still not great writing. Because once again, I, and I'm sure many others at the age I was, have been guilty of that many times. I mean, when you're young, you don't want anybody to actually die, so in my early days, characters would almost never stay dead unless they were the bad guy. No matter how much it would look like they died, they would always come back somehow. Obviously, this was before I learned that such things don't really work, as The Rise of Skywalker brilliantly shows. Now listen, the audience and characters believing a character is dead, and then it being revealed that they are still alive, can work, but only if it serves the story to do it that way. And the thing is, just like with me, all of these bait and switches don't serve any purpose beyond, don't worry, the character is actually fine. Now once again, The Rise of Skywalker has many, many other mistakes that are just as bad in this regard. But I just wanted to single that one out because it ties back into what I was saying. Now listen, I know I'm not the be-all to end-all when it comes to writing or anything like that, and to even try and compare my early writings to Star Wars movies probably makes me look insanely pretentious. But as I noted before, I'm not doing this to prop myself up, but instead to show just how poorly written those movies actually are. Because all of those mistakes I mentioned earlier, those are mistakes that somebody my age would be expected to make unless one is a child prodigy, which I absolutely wasn't. But they aren't ones that fully grown professional screenwriters should be making. They should know better than to be making such amateur mistakes. Because once again, I don't claim to have any professional training. I don't pretend to be an expert. And even I could tell that the writing quality was simply not there. And what helped me to see it was that I could draw on my own personal experiences when I was younger. As I've already said, these mistakes, and many others I didn't mention, are not ones that people working on a Star Wars movie should be making. Because while George Lucas, for example, had his issues with dialogue and conveying what he wanted to with his stories, all of that is more complex stuff that's harder to get right. But the basic stuff, such as everything I went over, he did perfectly, because he was actually a very competent writer who knew how to avoid amateur mistakes. Again, he may not have known exactly what he was doing, but he knew it better than that. Now, some might argue that the reason for all of these basic writing mistakes lies in the fact that they didn't have a plan. And that probably is true. I'd even say that was likely the biggest reason for it. But that still doesn't excuse some of the things they did here, as I already went over. I mean, for these people to tout that they are professional screenwriters and then turn out a product with such amateur mistakes, either they honestly had no idea what they were doing, or Disney was giving them impossible deadlines, which probably also had a lot to do with it. Because as is widely known, the more time one has to read over their scripts, the better it will end up. But once again, regardless of the reason for why they were written that way, hopefully this video has given you just a rough idea of why so many people insist that the Star Wars sequel trilogy was badly written. Because regardless of how one individually feels about the three movies, or the reason for why they turned out the way they did, there's no getting around the fact that a lot of the writing in them was pretty subpar at best. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like you to tell me, do you believe that the movies that made up the Star Wars sequel trilogy were actually pretty badly written all around and that my little comparison only proves that? Or do you still believe they're great movies that the parallels I drew to my writing experiences don't prove a thing? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Now let me just once again clarify that this video is not to promote any hatred for anybody who worked on the Star Wars sequel trilogy or imply that they are no talent hacks. I was simply pointing out that a lot of the mistakes they made were surprisingly basic ones and that I believe they could have done better. And as I even noted, the most probable reason for them were probably due to circumstances beyond their control. Now please keep in mind, you also don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel any way about the Star Wars sequel trilogy that you want to, and I nor anybody else can say that you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all very greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.